The penthouse towered above the city, a gleaming sanctuary of glass and steel that seemed to float in silence over the chaos below. Inside, the 5,000-square-foot space was meticulously curated, each detail designed to reflect wealth and control. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the living room, offering a panoramic view of the New York City skyline, a vast ocean of shimmering lights and distant movement. But despite the beauty of the view, it felt cold and remote, much like the life I had built. I stood by the window, looking out over the city I had conquered. At 38, I had everything the world said should make me happy: money, power, influence. Axiom Innovations, the tech company I had founded, had transformed the landscape of artificial intelligence and robotics. In the process, it had also transformed me, shaping my life into a relentless pursuit of success. The media loved to speculate about my wealth, about the mystery that surrounded my private life. But none of them knew me. No one did. I told myself for years that solitude was the price of greatness, that the distance between myself and others was necessary. It kept me focused, sharp. But tonight, standing alone in this immaculate fortress, I wasn't sure if I still believed that. The penthouse was perfect, impressive, everything in it, from the designer furniture to the abstract art on the walls, was selected with care, each piece chosen to project an image of control and refinement. Yet, for all its luxury, the space felt lifeless. No family photos, no personal mementos, just a flawless, sterile environment that echoed with emptiness. I walked across the room toward a sleek bookshelf filled with first editions and classic literature. The books were my only real companions, stories of imagined worlds and characters who seemed to live more fully than I did. It was ironic. While I was busy designing the future with machines that could think and learn, I had somehow neglected to understand my own heart. I could build technology that amazed the world, but I couldn't fill the void inside me. The soft hum of the elevator doors opening interrupted my thoughts. Kennedy, my housekeeper, stepped out with her usual quiet grace, a tray in her hands. "Good evening, Mr. Pratt," she said, setting down a cup of coffee on the marble counter. Her voice was calm, professional, but there was a warmth beneath her words that I often overlooked. Kennedy had worked for me for years, long enough to know my routines and preferences, yet she never intruded on my space. "Evening, Kennedy," I replied, offering her a polite nod. I reached for the coffee, appreciating its warmth more than its taste. "Is there anything else you'll be needing tonight?" she asked. I glanced at the clock. It was 8:00 p.m., the usual end to my workday. Meetings, calls, strategic reviews, all of it over for now. But as I faced the long hours ahead, I felt the familiar dread of an evening with nothing to fill it. "No, that'll be all for tonight." "Thanks," I said. Kennedy hesitated for a moment, a rare thing for her. When she spoke again, there was something cautious in her tone. "You know, Mr. Pratt, you might want to take a break one of these days. Go out, see people. It's good to disconnect sometimes." Her words caught me off guard. I looked at her, wondering if she was hinting at something more personal or if it was just an innocent observation. "I disconnect just fine," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. Kennedy nodded gently, accepting my response without argument. "Of course. Have a good night, Mr. Pratt." As she left, the word disconnect lingered in the air. I turned back to the window, staring out at the city again. It was the same view as always, distant, glittering, beautiful, but unreachable. The word seemed to take on new meaning as it echoed in my mind. Alone, disconnected. I thought back to something Lydia had once said to me, years ago during our late-night conversations at MIT. "You're obsessed with control, Landon," she had teased me, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "You never just let go. You never just live." At the time, I had laughed it off. I was building something, working toward the future, and I thought that was enough. I thought it would all fall into place eventually. But Lydia was gone now. No amount of success or ambition could bring her back. She had wanted more than I could give, more than ambition. In the end, she found that with someone else. I closed my eyes, pushing the memories away. It didn't matter anymore. She was part of the past, and I had chosen to move forward. My work became everything, and I convinced myself that I didn't need anything else. That had been true for a long time. But now, standing here in this empty penthouse, the weight of isolation felt heavier than ever. My phone buzzed, pulling me back to the present. A message from Finley, my assistant. Tomorrow's board meeting, confirmed for 9 a.m. Velasquez's team reached out about the dinner. He's looking forward to seeing you. I sighed. Work always filled the void. I typed a quick response, confirming the details. Yet, as I set the phone down, a flicker of doubt crept in. Was this it? Was this my life? An endless stream of meetings, deals, and late nights with no one to share it with. I took a sip of the coffee, the warmth spreading through me, momentarily easing the coldness of the thoughts that lingered. For now, it was enough. It had to be. The hours dragged on, the city below slowly quieting as midnight approached. I wandered through the penthouse, the echo of my footsteps amplifying the emptiness around me. Success had lifted me high above the noise and distractions of the world, but the higher I climbed, the lonelier it became. Up here, at the top, the air was thin, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could breathe it alone. The distant hum of the city outside the penthouse windows contrasted sharply with the noise in my head. I leaned against the glass, staring out over the skyline, but my thoughts were far from the glittering lights of New York. They were in a place much grittier, much simpler, a junkyard on the outskirts of Detroit, where my story really began. The clatter of rusted metal against gravel echoed in my mind, a vivid memory from childhood. The junkyards were my playground back then, a far cry from the sleek, pristine world I inhabited now. The smell of oil and the sight of discarded machines had been the starting point of everything, though I hadn't realized it at the time. It was there, among the wreckage, that Axiom Innovations was born, and where I learned the most important lessons of my life. I grew up in a modest house in a poor neighborhood, the kind of place where people worked hard, but never seemed to get ahead. My father did double shifts at the auto plant, his hands permanently stained with grease and his body worn from years of hard labor. My mother stretched every dollar to keep food on the table and the bills paid, though we often fell short. They were good people, tired, honest, and always trying their best. But they could only offer so much. For me, that wasn't enough. I dreamed bigger. Even as a kid, I knew I wanted more than what my parents could give. After school, I would sneak into the local junkyard, rummaging through the piles of discarded technology, searching for anything I could salvage. I didn't have much in terms of tools or knowledge back then, but I had a mind full of curiosity and a fierce determination to make something of myself. The first robot I ever built was nothing more than a pile of scrap parts, a toaster motor connected to a couple of bicycle wheels. It barely worked, but I was proud of it. I can still see my 12-year-old self in the old, faded photo I keep tucked away on a shelf, grinning ear to ear as I showed off my creation. Standing next to me, my father had one of the rare smiles I ever saw on his face, his tired eyes gleaming with pride. Back then, I was just a kid with big dreams, and they still believed in me. That was before everything changed, before success turned into an endless pursuit, blurring the lines between what I wanted and what I had. I found myself staring at that photo now, my eyes tracing the outline of my father, who had always seemed larger than life to me in those early years. He was the kind of man who believed in hard work and honesty. He thought those values would get me through life. And for a while, I believed him too. "You're too young to understand the weight of the world, Landon," he had said one night, as we sat in our cramped living room after a long day. The worn-out couch we sat on sagged under his weight, and his voice carried the kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. I understand plenty. I had snapped back, full of the arrogance that comes with youth. I'm going to build something big one day, bigger than this, bigger than all of this. I had waved my hand around at the room, at the tiny house we barely managed to hold on to. To me, everything seemed temporary, like it could collapse at any moment. But I didn't want temporary. I wanted permanent. I wanted power. My father had just smiled and shook his head. I believe you, son, but don't lose yourself along the way. Money and success, they're not everything. You'll see. At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought he was just too tired to see the potential I had, too beaten down by the grind of life to believe in more. But now, standing in my penthouse, far above the noise and grit of the world I came from, I understood. I had built something big, bigger than I had ever imagined. But somewhere along the way, I had lost parts of myself I wasn't sure I could get back. And then there was Lydia. I could still picture her as clearly as the day I first saw her. It was sophomore year at MIT, during a lecture on advanced robotics. She sat a few rows ahead of me, her dark hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders, her attention laser-focused on the speaker. Something about her drew me in immediately, her confidence, her intelligence, her presence. I had never met anyone like her. It wasn't long before we started spending all our time together. Studying, working on projects, talking late into the night about our dreams and ambitions. She understood me in a way no one else ever had. She had ambition, just like I did. But she also had something I didn't: balance. She knew how to live in the moment, how to enjoy life beyond the grind. Do you ever feel like we're from different planets? I had asked her one night in her dorm room, the dim light casting a soft glow on her face. We had been sitting on her bed, talking about our futures, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was always just a little out of reach. She had laughed, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Different planets, maybe. But I don't mind. You're different from anyone I've ever met, Landon. That's why She had paused then, like she was about to say something important, something real. But she didn't. She changed the subject, as she often did when things got too close to the truth. And maybe I let her, because deep down, I knew the truth too. Lydia came from wealth. She came from a world of privilege that I could never truly belong to, no matter how much I achieved. And eventually, that gap between us grew too wide to bridge. I had spent years chasing her, trying to catch up, trying to prove that I was enough. But in the end, I wasn't. I could still hear the final conversation we had. It played over in my mind like a broken record, each word cutting deeper than the last. I had demanded more of her time, more of her presence in my life, but she was always busy, always distant. It felt like she had one foot out the door already, and when I finally confronted her, I knew the answer before she said it. "I think we're too different, Landon," she had said, her voice soft but firm. "You're so focused on your future, on building something great, but I need someone who's here now." She didn't have to say it outright for me to know what she meant. I wasn't enough. Not for her, not for anyone. After Lydia left, I buried myself in my work. Axiom Innovations became my life, my obsession. I thought if I could just build something big enough, powerful enough, it would fill the void she left behind. But standing here, years later, in this empty penthouse, I realized that I had been wrong. Success had brought me everything I thought I wanted: power, influence, wealth beyond my wildest dreams. But it hadn't given me what I truly needed: connection, love, belonging. I closed my eyes, pushing away the memories of junkyards and heartbreak. My phone buzzed again, pulling me back to the present. Another message from Finley. "Velasquez is confirmed for the dinner. He's bringing his fiancée." I sighed, placing the phone down. Another meeting, another deal. The work never stopped. But for the first time, I wondered if that was a good thing. It was another busy afternoon at Axiom Innovations. The glass walls of my office, located high above the city, gave me an unobstructed view of the bustling streets below, a reminder of the empire I had built. Yet despite the success and accolades, the familiar feeling of emptiness lingered. It was as if all the achievements in the world couldn't fill the hollow spaces inside me. I sat behind my sleek desk, poring over the latest AI development reports, trying to focus on the work. But my mind kept drifting, distracted by thoughts I couldn't quite pinpoint. Finley, my assistant, knocked gently on the door before stepping in, not waiting for a response. He always did that when something important was brewing. "Landon," he said, walking toward me, his tone a mix of excitement and hesitation. "We've got a situation." I barely looked up from the report, still typing furiously on my keyboard. "What kind of situation?" I asked, my voice as detached as always when it came to business. "Matias Velasquez," Finley said, pausing for a moment as if to gauge my reaction. "He wants to move forward with the investment." That got my attention. I stopped typing and leaned back in my chair. Matias Velasquez was no ordinary investor. A prominent figure in the tech world, his name carried weight. Securing his investment would open doors for action that I had only begun to imagine. International expansion, new markets, bigger projects. I nodded slowly, waiting for Finley to continue. "But there's a catch," Finley said, his voice laced with hesitation. I raised an eyebrow, already sensing that whatever was coming next was going to be a problem. "What's the catch, Finley?" "He's invited you to a dinner this weekend," Finley explained. "Wants it to be more personal." I frowned, not quite understanding where this was going. "Personal? I can handle a dinner. What's the problem?" Finley shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable. "He's bringing his fiancée, Juliet. It's going to be a couple's dinner. He wants to meet you, and your significant other." I stared at him, my mind processing the information. A significant other? This wasn't the first time I had encountered these kinds of situations in the corporate world, mixing business with personal connections. It was becoming more common, especially among old-school investors like Velasquez. But that didn't make it any less frustrating. "You know I don't have a significant other," I said, my voice tight with irritation. Finley gave a nervous laugh, running a hand through his hair. I know, but it's important, Landon. Velasquez is the type who values relationships, trust, and personal connections. He's made it clear that he wants to see who you're spending your life with before he signs anything." I felt a wave of frustration rise inside me. Matias Velasquez wasn't the type of man to be dazzled by tech alone. I could give him the best pitch of my life, but it wouldn't matter if he didn't believe in the person behind the business. And apparently, that person had to come with a significant other. I leaned forward, rubbing my temples as I considered the dilemma. This deal wasn't just a regular business arrangement. It had the potential to define Axiom's future, to take the company to a level I had been striving for since its inception. But faking a relationship to seal the deal. The idea was ridiculous. Absurd. "What do you suggest, Finley?" I asked, reluctantly admitting that I was out of my depth when it came to this kind of thing. Finley hesitated, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Well, we could hire someone." I blinked, surprised. "Hire someone?" "You know, like an actress," Finley explained, his voice dropping as if he was afraid of being overheard. "It's not unheard of. Plenty of high-profile CEOs do it when they need to keep up appearances for a short time." For a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or throw something. The suggestion seemed absurd, but as the seconds ticked by, I couldn't deny that it might be the only option. I couldn't afford to let this deal slip away just because of a missing piece in my personal life. Matias Velasquez wanted to see the man behind the business, the man who had it all together, both professionally and personally. "Line up some candidates," I finally said, sighing in defeat. "But make sure it's discreet. I don't want this getting out." Finley looked relieved, nodding quickly. "Absolutely. I'll have a few candidates for you to look over by tomorrow." As he left the office, I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the city below. A part of me couldn't believe I was actually considering this. But then again, I didn't have much of a choice. Agshim's future depended on this deal, and if pretending to have a girlfriend for one night was what it took, then so be it. The next morning, true to his word, Finley presented me with a list of candidates. They were all polished, beautiful women with impressive resumes, models, actresses, socialites. But as I scrolled through the profiles, none of them felt right. They all seemed too perfect, too rehearsed. I needed someone who could blend in naturally, someone who wouldn't raise any suspicions. Frustrated after hours of reviewing profiles, I decided to take a break. I left the office, heading to my usual coffee shop down the street. The place was quiet in the late afternoon, and I ordered my usual black coffee before taking a seat by the window. It was there that I saw her. Ruby Payne, the barista who had been serving me coffee for months now. There was something different about her today. She wasn't polished or glamorous, like the candidates Finley had lined up, but there was an easy confidence in the way she carried herself. She had this natural charm, a groundedness that drew me in. She approached my table with her usual casual smile. "Here you go, Landon. Extra strong, just how you like it." "Thanks," I muttered absently, my mind already racing with an idea. It was crazy, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the right move. Before I could stop myself, I looked up at her. "Can I ask you something weird?" Ruby raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Weird? Sure, go ahead." I cleared my throat, suddenly feeling a little foolish. "How would you feel about being my girlfriend for a night?" Her eyes widened, and she blinked, clearly taken aback. "Excuse me? It's not what you think," I said quickly, trying to salvage the situation. "There's this business dinner, and the investor. He expects me to bring a date. I don't have one. It's purely professional, just one night." Ruby crossed her arms, studying me closely. "And how much are you willing to pay for this professional arrangement?" I appreciated her directness. "We can negotiate. I promise it's just for one evening, and I'll pay generously." She didn't say anything for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she let out a laugh, shaking her head. "Wow, that's the weirdest proposition I've ever gotten. But you know what? I could use the money." Relief washed over me. "Great, we'll take care of everything. You'll need a dress, and—" "Hold on," she interrupted, raising a hand. "If I'm doing this, I'm not just going to be some pretty face at your side. I want to be treated with respect, Landon. No bossing me around like one of your employees. And if anyone asks, we met through mutual friends. Got it?" I smiled, impressed by her assertiveness. "Deal." Ruby smirked, her eyes gleaming with amusement. "All right, Mr. CEO. Let's see how this goes." As I left the coffee shop that day, a strange mix of excitement and nerves buzzed inside me. This dinner was going to be more complicated than I had anticipated. Friday night arrived faster than I expected. The weight of the upcoming dinner with Matias Velasquez hung over me all week, a constant reminder that this wasn't just another business deal. It was a performance. And Ruby Payne, the barista I had pulled into my carefully constructed world, was now the key player. I wasn't sure what I had expected when I picked Ruby for this role, but I hadn't imagined her being as calm and composed as she was when she arrived at my office that evening. Dressed in a sleek black dress that perfectly balanced elegance and understatement, she looked nothing like the woman who had served me coffee countless times. Her transformation was startling, but it wasn't just the dress or the makeup. It was the way she carried herself, as though she'd done this 1,000 times before. "You clean up well," I said as I stood from my desk, straightening my suit jacket. "So do you," she shot back, a hint of amusement in her voice as she gave me an approving look. "Though I'm guessing this is your daily uniform." I smiled, feeling some of the tension in my chest loosen. "Pretty much." As we stepped into the elevator, the quiet hum of the descent filled the space between us. I couldn't tell if Ruby was nervous or simply playing it cool, but she showed no sign of anxiety. Meanwhile, I felt the weight of the evening pressing down on me. This wasn't just about the deal. It was about appearances, about Velasquez seeing something that wasn't really there. If we pulled this off, Axiom's future was secure. But if we didn't, I couldn't afford to think about that. "You seem tense," Ruby observed, breaking the silence as the elevator doors opened to the lobby. "Just focused," I said, my response clipped. She raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Focused? Or worried about impressing this Velasquez guy?" "It's a big deal," I admitted as we walked through the lobby toward the waiting car. "His investment could push Axiom into markets I've been eyeing for years. And yet, you're here with a barista from a downtown coffee shop to seal the deal." She teased lightly, her tone playful but not unkind. "Guess you needed the help more than you thought." Despite the gravity of the evening, I couldn't help but laugh at that. Ruby had a way of cutting through the tension, making me feel grounded in a way I wasn't used to. For someone who was walking into a world so far removed from her own, she seemed remarkably comfortable. "Fair point," I said as we slid into the backseat of the car. "You're definitely not my usual business partner." "Good thing," she quipped, smirking. "You'd be bored out of your mind." The drive to the restaurant was smooth, but my mind raced with thoughts of how the evening would unfold. I had rehearsed my lines, mapped out the conversation topics in my head, but there was still an unpredictable element to all of this. Ruby. She wasn't polished like the women I usually encountered in business circles, but that was what made her stand out. She was real, unpretentious, and I realized that was exactly why I had picked her. When we arrived at the restaurant, a Michelin-starred, dimly lit affair on the Upper East Side, Matthias and his fiancée, Juliet, were already seated at a private table in the corner. The setting was intimate, almost too intimate for the stakes of the evening. Matthias, tall and impeccably dressed, greeted us with his signature grin. His air of arrogance was hard to miss, the kind of confidence that came from being born into wealth and power. Juliet, with her blonde hair perfectly styled and her smile gleaming, was the picture of grace and warmth. She stood as we approached, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "Landon," Matthias exclaimed, extending his hand. "It's been too long, my friend." I shook his hand, returning his grin with one of my own. "Good to see you, Matthias. And this must be your lovely date," Matthias said, his eyes shifting to Ruby. Ruby stepped forward smoothly, her hand extended. "Ruby," she said with a confident smile, "it's a pleasure to meet you." "Please, call me Matthias," he replied, shaking her hand with a touch of admiration in his eyes. He was clearly impressed by her composure. He gestured toward Juliet. "And this is my fiancée, Juliet. It's so nice to finally meet you," Juliet said warmly, her eyes sizing up Ruby with friendly curiosity. As we took our seats, I glanced at Ruby, silently wondering how she would handle the evening. So far, she had blended into the role effortlessly, her natural charm carrying her through. It was as though she had slipped into this world of wealth and influence without missing a beat. The conversation started light. Matthias regaled us with stories from his recent travels, while Juliet chimed in with anecdotes about their life in Spain. Ruby, to my surprise, fit right into the flow, laughing at the right moments, engaging in the small talk with ease. But as the appetizers were cleared, the conversation shifted, and Juliet turned her attention fully to Ruby. "So, Ruby," Juliet began, her voice curious but friendly, "Landon mentioned you two met through mutual friends." I felt a flicker of panic, but Ruby didn't even blink. "Yes, we met at a dinner party a few months ago," she said with a smile that felt genuine. "A mutual friend thought we'd get along. And well, they were right." Juliet beamed. "That's wonderful. You seem to balance him out. Landon can be quite the workaholic, but it's good to see he's made time for someone special." I gave Ruby a sideways glance, impressed by how effortlessly she was handling this. She didn't just go along with the story. Weaving her own personality into it made it feel authentic. The more she spoke, the more I realized she was a natural at this, much more so than I had anticipated. Matthias leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of wine thoughtfully. You know, Landon, I've always admired your vision for Axiom. You think long-term, which is rare these days. But I have to say, seeing you with Ruby tonight, it's clear you have someone who keeps you grounded. That's important, especially when running a company like yours. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Matthias wasn't wrong, but the irony of his words wasn't lost on me. Ruby wasn't part of my life. At least not in the way he imagined. But I wasn't about to correct him. The rest of the dinner passed smoothly, the conversation flowing naturally between business and personal topics. Ruby held her own throughout the evening, impressing both Matthias and Juliet with her wit and charm. As dessert was served, Matthias shifted the conversation back to business, and I finally had my opportunity to lay out Axiom's expansion plans. I explained our vision for entering the European market, leveraging new AI technologies, and the potential for massive growth in the next decade. Matthias listened intently, nodding along. You're a visionary, Landon. That's what I like about you. You're not just thinking about the next quarter, you're thinking about the next decade. That's the kind of partner I want. Relief washed over me, but then Matthias added, but partnerships are built on more than just business. They're built on trust, on relationships. He smiled warmly at Ruby. And it's clear to me that you have someone who keeps you connected to what really matters. I glanced at Ruby, who was sipping her wine calmly, as though Matthias's words didn't carry the weight that they did. I gave a small nod, acknowledging his compliment, though inside I felt the weight of the deception. After dinner, as we said our goodbyes, Matthias shook my hand firmly. I'll have my legal team draw up the final agreement next week. Let's make this happen. As soon as Matthias and Juliet disappeared into their limousine, I let out a long breath, the tension finally easing out of my shoulders. The evening had gone better than I could have hoped, but as I looked at Ruby, I realized she had been the key to it all. You did great in there, I said as we got back into the car. Ruby glanced at me, a playful smile on her lips. You weren't so bad yourself, Mr. CEO. I laughed, shaking my head. Honestly, Ruby, I don't know how I would have pulled that off without you. She shrugged, her expression casual. That's what you hired me for, right? Yeah, I said quietly. That's what I hired you for. But as the car pulled away from the restaurant and we drove into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a business arrangement anymore. Something had shifted between us. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The weeks after the dinner with Matthias were a blur of meetings, expansion plans, and contracts. The deal with Velasquez had gone through smoothly, just as I had hoped. Axiom was moving into the European market faster than I had imagined, the numbers on track to exceed projections. By all accounts, everything I had worked for was finally falling into place. Yet the hollow feeling inside me remained, gnawing at me in quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts. Success had always been the goal, but now that I was standing on the threshold of everything I had dreamed of, I wasn't sure why it didn't feel like enough. I found myself returning to Ruby's coffee shop more often than usual, not for any specific reason. At least, that's what I told myself. I'd sit in the corner with my laptop or a stack of papers, conducting my meetings or reviewing reports, while sipping on the same strong coffee I ordered every day. But in the back of my mind, I knew I was there for more than just the caffeine. Ruby was a grounding presence in my life, even if she didn't realize it. There was something about her. The way she moved through the world with an ease I envied, the way she seemed so unaffected by the noise and pretense of the city. In a place like New York, where everything and everyone felt so transactional, she was a rare constant. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, I found myself at the coffee shop again. The place was nearly empty, save for a few late-night customers. Ruby was behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine with the same casual efficiency I had come to expect from her. I stood at the counter, watching her for a moment before she noticed me. She glanced up, a smirk tugging at her lips. Back again. I'm starting to think you're addicted to my coffee. I chuckled, shaking my head. It's definitely not the coffee. She raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. Oh, really? What is it then? I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Ruby had a way of disarming me, making me feel more exposed than I was comfortable with. But there was something about her that made me want to be honest, to let down the guard I had spent so many years building. I don't know, I admitted. Maybe I just like the quiet. She laughed, setting down the rag she had been using. Quiet. In New York City, you're in the wrong place if that's what you're after. Maybe, I said with a small smile, glancing around the shop. But this place, it's different. Ruby leaned against the counter, studying me with those sharp, curious eyes of hers. Different how? I wasn't sure how to put it into words. The shop was just a coffee shop after all, but it felt like more than that. It felt real, grounded, in a way that the rest of my life didn't. You ever get the feeling that you're just going through the motions? I asked, my voice quieter now. Like you're working towards something, but once you get there, it doesn't feel like enough. Ruby's expression softened, and she tilted her head, her eyes thoughtful. All the time, she said simply. I mean, I didn't exactly plan on spending my life slinging coffee for people who don't even remember my name. But here I am. I looked at her, surprised by the raw honesty in her words. So why do you stay? She shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. It pays the bills, and it's a simple life. Besides, I've got my brother to think about. I'm doing what I can to support him. So for now, this is enough. Her words hit me harder than I expected. She had chosen a simpler life, one focused on family and responsibility. She wasn't chasing wealth or power like I had been, and in a way that made her seem stronger than anyone I knew. You ever think about doing something else? I asked, genuinely curious. Sure, Ruby said, leaning back against the counter. But it's not that easy. My brother's in high school, and he's still figuring things out. I can't just up and leave him to chase a dream, you know. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. You're putting someone else before yourself. That's something. Ruby looked at me, her eyes searching mine for a moment. And what about you, Landon? What are you chasing? I hesitated, the question catching me off guard. I had always known the answer before. Success, power, achievement. But now, standing here, with Ruby looking at me like she saw something more than the CEO of Axiom Innovations, I wasn't so sure anymore. I don't know, I said quietly. I thought I was chasing success. But now that I'm here, I'm starting to wonder if that's all there is. Ruby smiled softly, her gaze steady. You've got everything you ever wanted, Landon. Maybe it's time to figure out what actually makes you happy. The simplicity of her words struck me, as if she had summed up a truth I had been avoiding for years. For so long, I had been focused on building, achieving, moving forward. But I hadn't stopped to ask myself what it was all for. And now that I had everything I had worked for, the question felt more important than ever. How do you figure that out? I asked, half joking, but also half serious. Ruby laughed, shaking her head. I don't have all the answers. But I think it starts with letting go of the idea that success is the endgame. Maybe you need to start thinking about what brings you peace, instead of just what looks good on paper. Peace. I echoed, the word unfamiliar in the context of my life. I couldn't remember the last time I felt peaceful. I had spent so many years chasing the next big deal, the next milestone, that the idea of peace felt foreign. Yeah, Ruby said, her tone lighter now. You know, being able to sleep at night without worrying about what you have to lose. Knowing that you're happy with who you are, not just what you've built. I looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Peace. happiness. They sounded like things from another life, another world. But as I stood there, watching Ruby, someone who seemed to have less than I did, but somehow more at the same time, I realized that maybe I had been chasing the wrong things all along. "I don't think I've ever felt that," I admitted softly. Ruby smiled gently, her gaze never wavering. "Then maybe it's time for a transformation." I frowned, the word catching me off guard. "What do you mean?" "You've spent your whole life becoming this version of yourself," Ruby said, her voice thoughtful but direct. "The CEO, the success story, the guy who has it all. But maybe now you need to figure out who you are outside of all that. Maybe it's time to let go of the old version of you and see what else is out there." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. The idea of letting go of the life I had built seemed impossible, absurd even. I had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to just walk away from it all. But at the same time, a part of me knew she was right. I wouldn't even know where to start. I said, shaking my head, "That's the thing about change," Ruby said, standing up from the counter and giving me a small smile. "You don't have to know the whole plan. You just have to take the first step." As she walked back behind the counter, her words echoed in my mind. She was right. Maybe I didn't need to have all the answers right away. Maybe all I needed was to take that first step. But the question was, what was the first step? The night of the dinner with Matthias Velasquez had arrived, and despite my calm exterior, I was more nervous than I had been in a long time. I had faced down billion-dollar negotiations, sat in rooms with the most powerful people in the tech industry, and built an empire from the ground up. But this dinner felt different. It wasn't just about securing an investment. It was about presenting a version of myself that I hadn't been in years. For the first time in a long while, I had to show that I wasn't just the CEO of Axiom Innovations. I had to show that I was a man with a life outside of work, a man with a personal life and relationships. And that's where Ruby came in. She arrived at my office exactly on time, looking effortlessly stunning in the emerald green dress we had picked out together earlier that week. Her hair, which she usually wore in a casual ponytail or loose waves, was styled elegantly, falling just below her shoulders. The dress hugged her in all the right places, but it wasn't flashy. It was sophisticated, understated. She had an air of confidence that surprised me, as though she had been doing this her whole life. "You look amazing," I said, genuinely impressed. "So do you," she replied with a smirk, eyeing my tailored suit. "Though I'm guessing this is just another day at the office for you." I chuckled, offering her my arm. "Pretty much." As we descended in the elevator, the weight of the evening pressed down on me. This wasn't just about impressing Matthias. It was about pulling off the illusion of a relationship. I had rehearsed my talking points, gone over every possible scenario in my head, but there was still an unpredictable element to all of this. "Ruby," I stole a glance at her as we rode down. She seemed calm, collected, as if this was just another casual evening out. But I couldn't help but wonder if she was as nervous as I was. "You seem tense," Ruby observed, breaking the silence. "Just focused," I said, not wanting to admit how much the evening was weighing on me. "Focused," she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Or worried about impressing Velasquez?" "It's a big deal," I said with a sigh. "His investment could expand Axiom in ways I've been planning for years. And here you are," she said with a teasing smile, relying on a girl from a coffee shop to help seal the deal. Despite my nerves, I laughed. "Well, you did great last time. I'm trusting you to pull this off again." She grinned, giving my arm a light squeeze. "Don't worry. I've got your back." The restaurant was one of those exclusive places that practically screamed wealth and status, low lighting, plush leather chairs, and private dining areas. It was the kind of place where deals worth millions were casually made over a glass of wine. As the maitre d' led us to our table, I could feel the pressure building. Matthias and his fiancée, Juliet, were already seated, looking every bit the power couple they were. Matthias stood up as we approached, his sharp eyes scanning me before settling on Ruby. A wide grin spread across his face, his hand outstretched. "Landon, good to see you, my friend," he said, pulling me into a firm handshake. "Matthias," I replied with a smile, returning the handshake. "It's been too long." "And this must be the lovely Ruby," Matthias said, turning to her with a warm smile. Ruby stepped forward, her own smile bright but composed. "Yes, it's a pleasure to meet you, Matthias. And this is my fiancée, Juliet," Matthias added, motioning to the blonde woman seated beside him. Juliet stood, her eyes gleaming with curiosity as she extended her hand. "Ruby, it's so nice to finally meet you. I've heard so much about you," Juliet said warmly. Ruby laughed lightly, shaking Juliet's hand. "All good things, I hope." As we took our seats, I couldn't help but marvel at how effortlessly Ruby fit into the scene. She was charming without being over the top, her conversation flowing naturally with Matthias and Juliet, as though she had been part of this world her whole life. I watched her closely throughout the evening, impressed by how she seemed to handle every moment with grace and confidence. The conversation began with the usual pleasantries, small talk about travel, business, and the latest trends in tech. Matthias was his usual charismatic self, but I noticed how his eyes often drifted to Ruby, clearly impressed by how she carried herself. Juliet, too, seemed to be drawn to her, asking her questions about life in New York, how we had met, and how she managed to balance everything so effortlessly. Ruby didn't miss a beat. "We met through mutual friends," Ruby explained with a smile when Juliet asked how we had come together. "It was one of those chance meetings that just seemed to click." Juliet beamed, clearly loving the story. "That's wonderful. You seem to balance him out. Landon can be so focused on work, but it's nice to see he has someone who helps him step back." I glanced at Ruby, wondering how she was able to weave such a seamless narrative. She didn't just play the part, she made it believable. For a moment, even I was convinced. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned toward business. Matthias was eager to hear more about Acxiom's expansion plans, and I seized the opportunity to lay out our vision for entering the European market. I talked about our latest AI developments, the potential for growth, and how this partnership could revolutionize the industry. Matthias listened intently, nodding along with each point. "You've always been a visionary, Landon," Matthias said, his tone thoughtful. "That's what I've admired about you from the beginning. You're not just thinking about the next quarter, you're thinking about the next decade." I smiled, relieved to hear the compliment. But then Matthias shifted the conversation in a direction I hadn't anticipated. "But partnerships, Landon," he said, glancing at Ruby, "they're built on trust, on relationships. It's clear that you have someone who grounds you, someone who keeps you connected to what really matters." Ruby, ever the professional, smiled softly as she sipped her wine. I nodded, unsure of how to respond. Matthias wasn't just talking about the business anymore. He was talking about the man behind the company. And while the words were flattering, they also felt like a reminder of the illusion we were presenting. By the time dessert was served, the conversation had lightened, and Matthias was ready to finalize the deal. We shook hands, and as we stood to leave, he gave me one last approving nod. "I'll have my legal team reach out next week," Matthias said, a confident grin on his face. "I'm looking forward to working with you, Landon, and it's been a real pleasure getting to know Ruby." Ruby smiled warmly, shaking his hand. "The pleasure's been mine, Matthias." As we left the restaurant and slid into the waiting car, I let out a long breath, the tension finally easing from my shoulders. The evening had gone better than I had expected. The deal was secure, and Ruby had once again exceeded my expectations. "You were incredible in there," I said as the car pulled away from the restaurant. Ruby shrugged casually, a small smile playing on her lips. "I told you I had your back." I laughed, shaking my head. "Honestly, Ruby, I don't know how I would have pulled that off without you." She glanced at me, her expression more serious now. Well, that's what you hired me for, right? Right, I said, my voice quieter now. That's what I hired you for. But as we drove through the quiet streets of New York, I couldn't help but feel that this arrangement, this business transaction, was beginning to blur into something else, something I hadn't anticipated, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. The morning after the dinner with Matthias dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the massive windows of my penthouse. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The deal with Matthias was secured. The future of Axiom Innovations looked brighter than ever. And yet, as I sat at the kitchen island sipping my coffee, I found my mind wandering not toward the business, but toward Ruby. She had been the key to the entire evening's success. Her calm, effortless charm had smoothed over every interaction, and I found myself wondering how someone so far outside my world could fit into it so perfectly, even if it was just for show. There was something different about her, something I couldn't shake, and that left me with a question I didn't know how to answer. What was I going to do now? Kennedy, my housekeeper, entered the kitchen with her usual efficient grace. She moved around the kitchen, preparing a light breakfast, her movements familiar and comforting. "Good morning, Mr. Pratt," she greeted, placing a plate of fruit on the counter. "How did the dinner go last night?" "It went well," I said, nodding as I took a sip of coffee. "Matthias is moving forward with the investment." Kennedy smiled knowingly, a twinkle in her eye. "And how was your date?" I laughed softly, shaking my head. "It wasn't a date, Kennedy. It was a business dinner." "Sure," she said, her tone teasing. "But from what I hear, you seem to enjoy having Ruby with you." I looked at her, realizing she had probably overheard some of the calls with Finley and my conversations about Ruby. "She was helpful," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Helpful," Kennedy echoed, clearly amused. "That's one way to put it." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. She was more than helpful. I wouldn't have been able to pull it off without her. Kennedy leaned against the counter, her expression softening. "You know, Landon, maybe it's time to let someone in. You've spent so long building your empire, but it's not much fun if you're doing it alone." I frowned, not entirely sure how to respond. Kennedy had been with me for years, long enough to see me through the highs and lows of my career, and while she never pried into my personal life, her words carried a weight that made me pause. "Let someone in," I repeated, more to myself than to her. She nodded, giving me a small smile. "You've been running on autopilot for too long. Maybe it's time for a change." Her words echoed in my mind as I headed to the office later that morning. A change. The thought felt both foreign and intriguing, like a path I hadn't considered but might be worth exploring. The day at Axiom was busy, as usual. Meetings, presentations, more planning for the European expansion. Yet, through all the hustle and focus, my thoughts kept drifting back to Ruby. I found myself scrolling through my phone during breaks, looking at the photos Finley had snapped at the dinner. There was one of us laughing together, Ruby's eyes sparkling with amusement as she leaned in slightly toward me. It was a candid shot, not posed or planned, and it captured something real. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was seeing myself outside of the CEO role, outside of the responsibilities that defined me. And that was when I made a decision. That evening, as I left the office, I called Ruby. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her voice light and cheerful. "Landon, what's up? Everything okay?" "Yeah, everything's fine," I said, trying to sound casual. "I was just thinking, would you like to have dinner with me tonight? Just us." There was a brief pause on the other end before Ruby responded, her tone teasing. "Dinner, huh? Is this a business dinner, or something else?" I smiled, though she couldn't see it. "No business this time. Just two people having dinner." "I like the sound of that," she said. "Where are we going?" "Your choice," I replied. "Pick a place you like. Something different." "Okay, How about that little Italian place downtown? I've been wanting to try their risotto, she suggested. Italian sounds perfect. I'll pick you up at 7. 7 it is. See you then, she said, her voice warm with excitement. I hung up, a sense of anticipation building inside me. It was strange, this feeling. Something I hadn't experienced in years. Not nervousness exactly, but something close to it. A mix of curiosity and hope. Later that evening, I arrived at Ruby's apartment, my nerves humming beneath the surface. When she opened the door, I was momentarily taken aback by how effortlessly beautiful she looked. She wore a soft blue blouse, paired with dark jeans that hugged her figure, and her hair was styled in those same loose waves I had come to associate with her. She didn't need anything more. Her natural beauty was enough. You look amazing, I said, unable to hide my admiration. Thanks, she replied, a playful glint in her eye. You're not too bad yourself, Mr. CEO. I laughed, shaking my head. Ready for some risotto? Absolutely, she said, stepping out and locking the door behind her. The restaurant was cozy and intimate, with dim lighting and the warm, rich smell of Italian food filling the air. It was a far cry from the upscale, Michelin-starred establishments I was used to, but that was the point. This felt more real, more relaxed. As we settled into our corner table, I found myself slipping into conversation with Ruby easily. There were no pretenses here, no need for appearances or careful words. We talked about her life at the coffee shop, her brother, and her dreams of doing something more. You've got a lot of potential, I said after we ordered. You could do so much more than make coffee. Ruby smiled, but there was a hint of wistfulness in her eyes. Maybe, but for now, I'm where I need to be. My brother's still in high school, and I need to make sure he's taken care of before I start thinking about my own dreams. I nodded, admiring her sense of responsibility. What's he into? You said before he likes tech. Yeah, he's obsessed with gadgets and old computers. Spends hours tinkering with them, trying to figure out how they work, she said, her face lighting up with pride. I think he's got a real talent for it. Maybe I could help him out, I offered, surprising myself with how much I wanted to get involved. Give him some guidance, point him in the right direction. We could even arrange a tour of Axim. Let him see what's possible. Ruby's eyes widened with excitement. Really? That would mean the world to him. He looks up to people like you, you know. You're kind of a big deal in his world. I chuckled, shaking my head. I'd be happy to do it. He's got potential, and if I can help him, I will. The rest of the dinner flowed smoothly, our conversation bouncing between light-hearted banter and deeper topics. I found myself genuinely enjoying Ruby's company, her laugh infectious, and her insights refreshing. There was something about being around her that made everything else seem less complicated, less heavy. After dinner, we took a leisurely stroll down the street, the city lights twinkling above us like stars. The night air was crisp, but not uncomfortably so, and I felt a strange sense of peace walking beside her. You know, this was really nice, Ruby said as we paused in front of a small park. I didn't expect to have this much fun. I smiled, turning to her. Me neither. I think I've been missing something in my life. Something like this. Ruby looked up at me, her expression softening. Maybe it's time to let go of the idea that success is everything. I nodded slowly, realizing how true her words were. I think you're right. I've spent so long chasing success. But now, I want more. And what's more? She asked, her voice curious. I don't know, I admitted, but I want to find out. With you. Ruby's smile widened, her eyes reflecting the city lights. I'd like that, Landon. But let's take it one step at a time. No rushing. I reached out, gently taking her hand. One step at a time, I agreed. As we continued walking, hand in hand, I felt something shift inside me. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a series of business deals and milestones. It felt like something more. something real. And with Ruby by my side, I was ready to embrace it. Months passed, and with each passing day, my life began to change in ways I hadn't anticipated. The expansion of Axiom into the European market was well underway, the numbers soaring beyond our expectations. By all accounts, everything was going exactly as I had planned. But the biggest shift wasn't in the company, it was in me. Ruby had become a constant in my life, not just as the woman who helped me secure a deal, but as someone who grounded me, who brought me back to what truly mattered. Our relationship had grown naturally, without the pressure or expectations I had always placed on myself. For the first time, I felt like I had let someone in, not just into my world, but into the parts of me I had kept hidden for so long. Our nights were no longer filled with business dinners and networking events. Instead, we spent time exploring the city, eating at her favorite restaurants, visiting art galleries, and just talking about life, about dreams, about everything in between. I found myself looking forward to those moments more than anything else. Ruby's brother, Tom, had even come to visit Axiom. I gave him a tour of the labs, introduced him to some of our engineers, and watched as his eyes lit up with excitement. It was like seeing a younger version of myself. The same hunger, the same spark of curiosity that had driven me all those years ago. I made sure he had the resources to pursue his interests, and it felt good to give back in a way that went beyond money or status. As for Axiom, the company was thriving. The deal with Matthias had opened up doors I had only dreamed of, and yet I no longer felt the same sense of urgency to climb higher. I was still driven, still focused, but I had learned to take a step back, to appreciate the life I had built. Not just the business, but the connections I had formed along the way. One evening, as Ruby and I sat on the balcony of the penthouse, looking out over the city, I realized how much my perspective had shifted. The view that had once felt distant and cold now seemed full of possibility, full of life. I wasn't alone up here anymore. "You know," Ruby said, her voice soft as she leaned against me, "I never thought I'd end up in a place like this, or with someone like you." I smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Neither did I." She laughed softly, her hand resting on mine. "Do you ever miss it?" "Miss what?" "The chase, the endless pursuit of success," she said, her tone thoughtful. "Do you ever wish you could go back to that?" I thought about it for a moment, the old version of myself flashing through my mind. The man who had been so focused on the next big deal, the next milestone, that he had lost sight of everything else. The man who had thought success was the only thing that mattered. "No," I said, shaking my head. "I don't miss it. Not anymore." Ruby looked up at me, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Good, because I kind of like this version of you." I chuckled, pulling her closer. "So do I." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the city's lights twinkled in the distance. The air was crisp, the sounds of the world below us muted, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. Not the fleeting kind that came with a successful deal or a closed contract, but the lasting kind that came from knowing I was exactly where I was meant to be. I had spent so much of my life chasing success, chasing an idea of what happiness looked like. But now, sitting here with Ruby, I realized that the real success wasn't in the company I had built or the wealth I had amassed. It was in the people I had let into my life, the connections I had formed, and the peace I had found within myself. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, that didn't scare me. I wasn't running anymore. I was finally living.